Virginia Woolf's The New Dress is part of a small collection of work that she had that flowered out of the writing of her novel Mrs. Dalloway, which in itself was really an experiment of cobbling together some somewhat disparate pieces from other short stories. And I think experiment is a fair word to use here, not in the sense that it's hit or miss in terms of its results, but just in the terms of she is one of the more experimental writers of those early 20th century years, pushing the boundaries of what fiction could do, what simple composition could impact, mainly through the maneuverings of style. It's less in modernism. It is always much less about what is said than the way it is said, and that's where the real substance of the art comes from. She is often paired, of course, with James Joyce, sometimes to her detriment, but she is an early champion of stream of consciousness style, where you are taken inside the perspective of a character in a way that few writers had attempted before. First person had been with us for quite some time, but often with a very sharply edited and carefully curated presentation. Stream of consciousness kind of tosses that out and just says, okay, we're just going to essentially take a tape recorder to this character's thoughts for a given period of time. And Mrs. Dalloway is largely like that, suspended over the course of a novel, much like Joyce's Ulysses is like that, suspended over the course of a novel. And in doing that, you get a very intimate view of a character, and specifically, you get an intimate view of that character through, more than anything else, the character's voice. The character's voice is everything. It carries the sense of the character, not only in what the character thinks, but how they think it, and the way their thoughts tend to organize themselves. And you see that expressed in the language. And with Woolf, it's very difficult to read Woolf without echoes of her own background trying to intrude on the reading process, because she did have some difficulties with mental stability. She ultimately committed suicide. She had some very fraught emotional relationships throughout her life that can linger as you're sitting there reading her stuff. I'm always very cautious about any biographical information. I don't really want to know anything about the writer, at least for the duration of the reading experience, because that shouldn't be in there, and it's unfair to her. She was a very, very thoughtful and careful artist who wasn't necessarily just writing her own neuroses onto the page, but she was detailing in very specific and deliberate manners how the human mind functions, or misfunctions, as it were. And you see some of that. You see a lot of that, quite frankly, in The New Dress, where you have this character who is drowning in her own insecurity and her own self-consciousness. And on the surface, it's very, you can read this story and you know, what is this? She's just sort of rambling as she's getting ready to go to this party. And she goes to this party, and then that's pretty much it. But along the way, you get this perception of how she sees the world and how her thoughts tend to structure themselves as she goes through that world. And the way this comes out through the language, through the voice, is really very powerful. just the beginning. Mabel had her first serious suspicion that something was wrong as she took her cloak off, and Mrs. Barnett, while handing her the mirror and touching the brushes and thus drawing her attention, perhaps rather markedly, to all the appliances for tidying and improving hair, complexion, clothes, which existed on the dressing table, confirmed the suspicion that it was not right, not quite right, which growing stronger as she went upstairs and springing at her with conviction as she greeted Clarissa Dalloway, she went straight to the far end of the room, not to a shaded corner where a looking glass hung and looked. There's a lot going on in there, and that's an odd way to start a story. Quite frankly, it's like there's so much there that to begin a story like that is really not very kind to the reader. It is expecting the reader to do an awful lot of work to make sense of all of that, to catch up. Maybe the reader is familiar with Mrs. Dalloway, the Clarissa Dalloway of this mention. Maybe the reader is not aware of this, so that background might be important, but you can get by without it. But you get the sense that you're just sort of suddenly listening in on this interior monologue that maybe you have some context for and maybe you don't, but the experience of it is very dislocating, it's very confusing, and that's important. That is deliberate, because her thoughts are kind of scattered. You're trying to trace that sentence. That is one sentence I read. You're trying to trace it through all these little digressive clauses here and there. She notices this and that and the other thing, and it's all over the place, and that's the point. This person is not a particularly logical, coherent thinker. Her thoughts are kind of a jumble. Her thoughts are kind of a mess, quite frankly, and her impressions as she takes them in from the outside world are almost like colliding in her head, and she's trying to take it all in and still make her way through the world, but it's difficult for her, and that's intention. That's really the whole drama right there in that first sentence. Significantly also, you get an attention to stuff that is distinctly feminine. She mentions, while handing her the mirror, touching the brushes, makeup brushes, attention to all the appliances for tidying and improving hair, complexion, clothes, all of this stuff for getting ready, getting dressed and made up, go to a party. A focus on trying to look proper to go out in public, and this sense of this deep anxiety inside. These are all her thoughts, the anxiety inside, and while trying to attend to the exterior, the superficial, the happy, let's go out in public and make a good impression. You get a sense of that conflict right away. The difference between focusing, on the superficial, on the exterior, on the physical, but still being so disorganized on the inside. And that kind of fractiousness, because the language helps that. The language adds to that. The voice compounds that. Just by that entire first sentence is followed by, no, it was not right. Something very deliberate and declarative, versus all of that mess beforehand, all that snaking doubt and confusion. Suddenly, no. Sharp contrast, a sudden dislocation again. So your reader is never particularly comfortable reading this. The reader is sort of like pushed all over the place, stopped and started and jerked all over, because there's no real logical, calm way to make your way through this story. And you get this throughout, this huge wave of vulnerability, the inner self-consciousness and frustration about, She's concerned about this dress that she has to wear, but she dared not look in the glass. She could not face the whole horror, the pale yellow, idiotically old-fashioned silk dress with its long skirt and its high sleeves and its waist and all the things that look so charming in the fashion book, but not on her, not among these ordinary people. Again, that's sort of one somewhat circuitous sentence with a lot of different thoughts and feelings and emotions banging into one another the whole time. She felt like a dressmaker's dummy standing there for young people to stick pins into. This tremendous self-consciousness, doubt, sense of your own identity being not strong enough to survive in the world. And she's not talking about, wading into a jungle to try and get through. She's talking about going to a polite little dinner party in early 20th century England. It's not that hard, but maybe it is, because the drama is all inside. The doubt, the frustration, the anxiety is palpable. It is omnipresent. It is greater than any sense of individuality or self that she can ever muster. It's so old-fashioned, she said to Charles Burt, making him stop talking about her dress, which by itself he hated, on his way to talk to someone else. She always feels overlooked. She meant, or she tried to make herself think that she meant, that it was the picture and not the dress that was old-fashioned. This sense of the surface, again, the picture, the image, is not necessarily the same as the truth, the inner qualities of it. It's just about the superficial image that is the problem, and that sense of distance between exterior and interior, the perceptible perception of something, and the subjective reality of it, or the personal private reality of it. This crushing anxiety about the outward and the inward are just driving this poor woman. And this sense of anxiety is just boiling up through every sentence, and it gets honestly very disturbing when you get, Mabel's got a new dress, he said, and the poor fly was absolutely shoved into the middle of the saucer. This ongoing drama that she sees of a fly struggling in a saucer of milk, and it's a repeated image that you see, and it's her feeling drowned by everything. And she said, really, he would like her to drown. She believes that this person wants her to drown, and this in itself is very difficult to really read, because Virginia Woolf drowned herself, and that's how she committed suicide not too long after, well, actually, about 20 years after the story was written. But still, that sense of a soul struggling and always drowning in her environment is extraordinary. It is excruciating, quite frankly. She feels bored going through this party, alienated from it. Alienation is huge in the modern era. Just with all the harmless, superficial chit-chat that happens at polite little parties. Then Miss Holman sees her standing there, bore down upon her. Bore down, which sounds like she's being hunted. It's very antagonistic. Of course, a thing like a dress was beneath Mrs. Holman's notice, with her family always tumbling downstairs or having the scarlet fever. A little sense of the culture there, which is a very polite upper middle class garden culture, if you will. Could Mabel tell her if Elmthorpe was ever let for August and September? Trying to arrange a little summer cottage for a getaway. Is very bourgeois would be a term. This kind of stifling middle class dullness that she feels alienated from and squelched by at the same time. Her soul feels this great torment, but everything around her is pleasant and suburban and intimidating, horrifying in her calculation. And this sense of devastation reeks throughout this story of a human soul constantly at war with a reality that on its surface doesn't look at all bad, but it's the falseness of it, it's the superficiality of it that she thinks, that she feels, that she interprets, and it is the sense of being so inadequate to function in that society, that the society itself is somehow crushing her because she is so self-conscious, so insecure. One wasn't happy, it was flat, just flat, that was all. You get the sense of these terrible, this terrible boredom, this terrible ennui is the French term, this terrible frustration, almost disgust with the world around her that she can't feel any control of. She is struggling throughout for a kind of meaning, and her voice is desperate. So she got up from the blue sofa right towards the end, and the yellow button in the looking glass got up too, and she waved her hand. So she was disassociating from herself and the dress, and she feels disembodied, just completely outside everything. She's not of this world anymore. She waved her hand to Charles and Rose to show them that she did not depend on them one scrap, again very superficial, to show them something. And the yellow button moved out of the looking glass, and all the spears were gathered into her breast as she walked towards Mrs. Dalloway to say goodnight. They have this polite little exchange. "But it's too early to go," said Mrs. Dalloway, who was always so charming. Again, a very sense of smiling superficiality. "I'm afraid I must," said Mabel Waring, "but," she added in her weak, wobbly voice, which only sounded ridiculous when she tried to strengthen it, a sense of this horrible vulnerability. "I have enjoyed myself tremendously," which is a lie. She hasn't. She's been just tortured by self-doubt the entire time she's there. Is feeling extraordinarily intimidating and self-conscious. "I have enjoyed myself," she said to Mr. Dalloway, whom she met on the stairs. "Lies, lies, lies," she said to herself going downstairs. She is disgusted by the sense of falseness in the world, the sense of rage she feels at the superficiality, at the bourgeois viciousness of the people around her, the friends she has that she really doesn't like at all. She feels at war with her entire environment that is crushing her. It is crushing her mainly because she has no sense of identity, no sense of inner strength, no sense of self that can withstand that, but it is simply victimized by everything around her. And this is the voice that you hear throughout the story that is constantly struggling in desperation and out of breath and just anxious and trying to come up with some idea of this and that and the other thing. And is always distracted and something is just too much. That's the voice of a soul war and losing the war with the entire universe around it.